Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe that this is the 109th video in our second Master Series, the 58th video on basic processors, the 20th video on sculpting processors, and the 5th video on saturation. And in the last video, it was kind of long, but when we talked about the full spectrum saturation, trying to build that 3-tier saturation, that middle ground was that full spectrum saturation. Now, the concept there is that it's normally non-harmonic distortion. So you do work with even or odd harmonics when you're working on saturation a lot of times. And that non-harmonic distortion element that's not even or odd harmonics is that middle ground that helps kind of blend those things together, you know, and it really can affect things in a really beautiful way. You know, think about, you know, if you've got, you know, a violin that you stick your ear right up to it, it's got horrible noise and all kinds of non-harmonic distortion and saturation besides the sound itself and the sound envelope. But you put 6 or 7 together, or you stand back a ways and it sounds great. So, I mean, it can work really differently on different instruments. So basically, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about fine-tuning your saturation a little bit. The first thing I want to talk about fine-tuning, there's a bunch of ways you can do it, and you can shape it when you're putting in any one of those type of saturations. But a really cool way to help you control it, because a lot of times it's trying to control the envelope of whatever saturation you're putting in there. So you can have like split channels, like this right here is splitting the channel. So there's the right and left over here and the right and left over here. And there's a plugin called Sigmod that'll do this also, is that you can do this work on one side of it. So I'll like have this plug-in trash do, I'm doing my whatever type of saturation I'm doing on one side of it, and then I will bring that saturation up to where I'm happy with it, but it might be boosting in some areas I don't want it to, or not enough in areas I don't want it to, and like that. So I'll put an EQ on after it on that side, and then start shaping it, shaping the envelope of sound with an equalizer, trying to shape it somewhat. You have to understand that that envelopes can be moving around in octave ranges, but still you can shape it to some point like that. And the other side is clean. That way you can bring that up into it, which can help you become a little bit more surgical in your application if you can't apply it surgically from the plug-in or some other way. So it's a really good thing to keep in mind. Sometimes you're going to add just a little bit of even harmonics or a little bit of odd harmonics or a little bit of both or some full spectrum saturation, and you're fine. Or no, that can be the same as with noise, but sometimes it's not, and sometimes you got to do something like that to control it, so you can kind of shape it a little bit. So that's a work in progress. You know, that's not really been dealt with, in my humble opinion, really well in the industry without digging out things like MATLAB or something like that, which, you know, I mean, that's a whole nother level that we haven't even got to yet. So it's a really good thing to keep in mind that you can help. A lot of times it's still too much in the low end or the mid-range or the up end, that you can tame a little bit by doing it that way, and then blend it in with the clean track, the clean side that you have there, like a wet and dry mix. So you have a wet and dry on here, and this is adding wet and dry also. It gives a lot more control of how you're applying, because sometimes you need, especially out front things that are, everything is really noticeable. So kind of keep that in mind. The next thing we want to talk about is the saturation itself. So the concept here is really simple. That if you remember looking at even harmonics or odd harmonics and then a non-harmonic distortion, it's normally in the middle that's lower. Whenever you're adding that non-harmonic distortion or looking for it, the first problem you have is trying to keep from adding that much even or odd harmonics. Like if it's distortion, you know, pedal, it's just clipping distortion, you're going to get a lot of odd harmonics and really low level non-harmonic distortion a lot of times. So you have to put your odd harmonics up maybe a lot higher than you want to get that, the lower end, the low, really low non-harmonic distortion that you want to add in there to flavor it. So it's why I showed you to do it the way I did, because it may be full spectrum and it's not real surgical as far as individual harmonics, but it normally does a really good job. The concept here is that every piece of, you got 500 outboard desks, 500 outboard compressors, 500 outboard preamps, microphones, and they all may do that a little bit differently, and the combination of them is going to do things a little bit differently, and how the performer, how close they get to the microphone, and their vocalize themselves, that it's all going to blend together, so you end up with some kind of footprint that is a combination of all those things. So a lot of times, like we had talked about in the Saturation 3 basic tools, that sometimes if you're doing real specific genre and things like that, you can get a setup set up with those aspects we talk about there to try to simplify that. But otherwise, you're basically digging around in the dark a lot of times. The math is very complicated, so we're not going to get into that, and we will when we get into MATLAB later on and, you know, in-depth audio engineering. But for now, we're not, because it's just way too complicated for most stuff you're doing in the studio. That you can't apply it without pulling out something like MATLAB. So it's a lot of digging around. So it's like if I have that full spectrum saturation on this trash too, like I showed you, I can manipulate it to where, you know, it has a little bit different shape. Does that make sense? So it's like you'll have different non-harmonic distortion elements at different levels across there depending on how you set it up. And that can be the same as with multiple different ones. Like I've got Ozone Exciter here, that this plugin is, depending on which these things I use, this analog, retro, tape, tube, warm, is going to add different elements of non-harmonic distortion. Just be careful of too much normally odd harmonics, sometimes even harmonics, but you're trying to get that other stuff, but you're fighting with that because it's adding too much odd harmonics and not giving you that non-harmonic distortion you want to bridge that gap. So these kind of things can do that with experimentation. You know, there's like neutron here. This can do it. It's there. You got retro, tape, warmth, tube, all kinds of things that, and you can kind of, you know, experiment around with them. And there are tons of different distortion plugins. Most of them are going to give you odd harmonics predominantly, but will give you different footprints of non-harmonic distortion that you can do in ways that I showed you to try to tame the odd harmonics, go into it and try to control it a little bit more. And most of the time they have a wet and dry mix on them. So, you know, it's an experimental thing, because somebody might like this compressor that basically is like a really good compressor that has this distortion pedal on it that adds a little bit of odd harmonics with a really low mix ratio and a little bit of non-harmonic distortion in a way that sounds good to them. Does that make sense? And that combination works really well. Or it might be something different for somebody else. So it's a lot of experimentation, and why I showed you to do it the way I did to save you that headache, because I went through that for a while. But if you're really specific, that you do the same thing a lot, the same type of work a lot, the same genre and things like that, you know, keep that in mind and look at that, you know, Saturation 3 basic tools to try to more, you know, simplify the process, especially with that concept happening. Because that non-harmonic distortion is not the most predominant element when you're doing your saturation, but the three of them together doing that three-tier system that we talked about, they all blend together and work together just like the perfect setup of your gear. You know, you got, like back when you had the outboard gear and the perfect preamp that we're working with, the perfect microphone that's working with, the perfect compressor, the overdrive a little bit, and the perfect outboard gear and the desk, and it's just, yeah. But sometimes that might sound perfect on this violin you're working on or this vocalist you're working on, and then you get Bob that comes in with his banjo, and it doesn't quite sound as good, you know, and so you're searching around for a different microphone trying to figure out how to solve the problem, you know, and you can search around with that. But most of the time, the way I showed you works pretty well. But you can experiment with that because there are tons of plugins that will, I have all kinds of off-the-wall plugins that will add non-harmonic distortion elements, and your job is going to be trying to find out how to control that, get the envelope that you want and the content that you want, and being able to control more times than not the overriding even or odd harmonics. They'll be riding way above the non-harmonic distortion unless you crank it up to ridiculous levels. I mean, really push it way too hard, in which it's very unlikely most of the time you're going to be using that for saturation. So unless you cranked it all the way up and then brought a mix level of it and did it like we did on a separate track and then brought it in on the other side a little bit, you might be able to do it something like that. Something like that might work very well. You'd overdrive the crap out of one side and then EQ it a little bit, shape it a little bit, and then bring it up with the clean track a little bit like I showed you in splitting the channel. That might work well. You might come out with some really cool, non-harmonic distortion that's mixed with even or odd harmonics that are closer to the same levels that you can blend into there. But it's a work in progress, and a lot of times that you're spend your time trying to figure out how to make that work, which is part of becoming that next level master audio engineer, is experimenting around. And the more you experiment and the more you look around at different things that might pop, the better understanding you'll have of it, and the better understanding you'll have of what that means and what different ones have, the effect of different ones on different instruments and different types of productions and all that kind of stuff. Just don't get lost in that, because it's a very complicated thing that I've studied for a long time, and that was my simplified answer because it worked really well. So far, the kind of concepts I've been trying to relate to try to, it's next level master audio engineering, but that doesn't mean we want to, go to NASA and ask them if they can saturate our guitar track, right? So, not for now. In the next series, we will go there. So, just kind of keep that in mind and experiment around. And, as you watch those 3 videos and all the videos in saturation, that this one is to try to tie that together. So that one element can be very complicated, and most of the time is a lot of experimentation on your part and just seeing what you can make work, because it's like experiment with a bunch of different compressors until you can find one in a way that works really well with the kind of stuff you're doing or how you like it to sound, because they'll all sound just a little bit different. And the better you get with your acute listening, and the more detailed work you do and the better work you do, the more you will hear small differences. So, you will understand why the better engineer you get, sometimes you want to get better equipment, because you can really pick up the really minute details in micro details of the audio, what's happening, and start becoming an audiophile with the type of engineering you're able to do with your understanding and your abilities. So I hope that kind of cleared that up, so to get you experimenting, but not to try to help you from getting lost in that, and to try to explain to why I do it the way I do it. But that doesn't mean you might do it differently. And so by the time you get done with the saturation series, this is something you definitely want to take into consideration and experiment with the type of productions you're doing. Just remember, the more diversified you get, the more complicated you are going to be as an engineer, and that's just a fact of life that you're not going to escape. So you're going to have to just, buck up and take the time checking things out and trying different things on different things, like master audio engineer with, 500, awesome microphones, and finding just the right microphone for Timmy. The better you get and the more stuff you get, most of the stuff I try to teach is try to avoid you have to spend that kind of money. But sometimes, it's easier to buy, $500,000 microphone than mess with it that much. But normally, the way I try to show you, you should be able to emulate that or deal with the problems you're having with fairly inexpensive equipment, which most people have. So, peace, hope, love. I certainly hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that clears that up a little bit to get you experiment a little bit, but don't get lost in that. And I will see you in the next video.